This magnificent museum dates back to the 17th century, but many of the university museums represented by the UMG were created in the late 19th, in a period when museums were seen to enable and empower new disciplines, new forms of knowledge that were taking shape. That sense of a synergy, a necessary base between advanced experimental comparative knowledge and a museum is one I think most of us would have considered lapsed over the course of the 20th century. I think it is back now in senses that are perhaps more profound and important than we have quite caught up with and come to grips with. New approaches to a whole range of cross-disciplinary fields, from the sciences of dating and sourcing, heritage science, to science and technology studies, as well as more obviously history, art history, archaeology, anthropology, other disciplines have rediscovered the museum as a lab, a space of research and experimentation. I think in parallel, we're understanding increasingly that a collection is not an accumulation of objects. It's not the artifactual equivalent of a library. It's a relational assemblage with all the complexity and all of the fertile possibilities that perhaps awkward term might entail. I'd go further and say that a collection is a creative technology. Just ask Grayson Perry, or for that matter, any of the other artists in residence, or any of the other students, interns, everybody, conservators who engages with collections and discovers things in them, discovers things that they did not know were there before, and makes something new out of those discoveries. Knowing things through things is a method. I think in a sense the museum is a method, in senses we have yet to fully explore. Don't just take my word for it. I think one of the most striking and perhaps unprecedented aspects of the last decade has been a set of new commitments on the part of research funding agencies to projects that have been based in museums, projects that have not been treating museums as providers of services or resources, but projects that have used collections to pose new questions, test new methods, discover new sorts of things, funded by the AHRC, the ESRC, the European Research Council, the Leverhulme, among other bodies, among other bodies, including others I'm sure that I'm not particularly aware of. I'm delighted to hand over to the panelists. We're all going to try to speak fairly briefly, leaving, I hope, at least 20 minutes or so at the end. Paul Smith is the director of the splendid Oxford University Museum of Natural History.
Geologists and visual beasts, so let me indulge myself. A few PowerPoints. I'd like to give you a very brief, a very personal view of where I think research sits in university museums, and hopefully a provocative or slightly provocative as well. I think university museums are more complex beasts than many other museums, certainly than most civic museums. They're more complex beasts than academic departments for the most part as well. And I think that's where the fun comes from for those of us who are fortunate enough to work in university museums. That's where the sense of dynamism comes, the sense of activity, the sense of being able to explore things in different ways. And I just want to go back to the basic themes of this conference and just see where research sits within the overall role of university museums. So I would argue that there are four principal roles of university museums. You could rotate the names around the apices, but the four, I would say, would remain the same. And they're distinct, but they're interlinked, they're overlapping, and there are all sorts of connectivities between them. And those four you can see, the research, university education, public engagement, and schools education. And we get different strands of finance for different parts of those activities and different pairs of those activities and different combinations. I really did produce this before Chris Smith spoke last night. It's very similar, I realise, and there's one thing that's missing, of course, and that's stewardship. Stewardship, curatorship, collections, call it what you will. And I would argue that that activity underlies as a substratum the diamond that you can see on the screen. It's an essential prerequisite, in other words, of all of those activities. But collections work, curatorship, stewardship cannot, in the current environment, be an end in itself. It has to be a means to an end. With increasingly parsimonious funding, we cannot justify ourselves as simply being the holders and guardians and custodians of collections. We have to be seen to be doing something with them. And that's a message that I think that Hedley Swain put over in the latest issue of the Museum's Journal very well, and he hit the nail on the head. That we have to be making impact, small I, in each of these areas if we are to justify our existence and get a steady stream of funding for those activities. But, and it's a big but, we can't just hammer forward with these four areas without forgetting that it is collections and stewardship that underpin them all. Because without those collections, we're just theme parks. And therefore, we have to be cognizant all the time. A museum could deliver in many of these areas for a limited amount of time, but I would argue that it would eventually run out of steam if it loses connections with that essential underpinning of the collections. I would also argue that it's absolutely independent of scale. I would say that this activity applies regardless of whether a university museum has one curator or is the Ashmolean. And I can speak personally from that because up until a year ago I was the director and probably sole employee of what is the smallest of the Hefke funded museums, the Lapis Museum in Birmingham. And now I'm at the Natural History Museum here. But essentially the range of activity is the same. It's only the volume that differs. So in other words, research is an absolutely key component of what university museums are and what they're for. So let me just go through some of those research agenda very briefly. Of course, we're responsible for research facilitation, both within our host institution, and importantly, for that Hefke stream, if nothing else, but from instinct alone, for other HEIs. And of course, we've become very wrapped up in the public engagement agenda, particularly with impact with a capital I associated with the REF. But there's an interesting point here. There's much talk about the contribution of museums to REF impact. It'll be very interesting to see how many public engagement studies really go into the REF and how they fare. Because at the moment, my suspicion is that we're not collecting the data that can really create good REF impact studies, and we need to really gear ourselves up, assuming there's another REF cycle, to begin to deliver that. My own unit of assessment, UOA7 of the Environmental Sciences, is particularly helpful in spelling out exactly how public engagement is going to be measured. First of all, it has to be specific research linked to outputs. It can't just be our generic knowledge of collections. It has to be based on a single publication or a corpus of publications if it's going to score in the REF. There has to be reach, and that's specifically, according to the UOA7 guidelines, not just visitor numbers. They won't consider that as justification. It has to involve reach that documents the types of audiences, any secondary reach, media, and other sorts of quantitative indicators. there also has to be evidence not just of reach, of breadth, but of significance, evaluation data, user feedback, critical external reviews, etc., third-party funding that stems from it. At the moment, certainly in museums that I'm closely familiar with, we don't tend to have those data to hand, and we haven't been collecting them because impact was sprung on us at quite a late stage. But as a community, if we're going to really demonstrate our value to universities, we really do need to gear up quickly for the next ref cycle. So just going back to the research roles, we have, as we've seen in the last session, the important responsibility of generating that next cohort of collections-focused researchers to stimulate that excitement. And we can do that in a variety of ways, embedding postgrads, postdocs, but also I think there's a space for tempting undergraduates with research internships. Generation of internationally leading collections-focused research. We have to be demonstrating that we're delivering the highest quality of research, but based on our collections. In other words, we need a distinctive research voice. There's no point in us competing with academic departments. By and large, they're much better geared up than university museums. By all means, let's collaborate with them, but also let's find a distinctive research voice that articulates the value of collections. And in my own field of natural history, there's a real responsibility as funders move away from alpha taxonomy and systematics. There's increasing concern. At a national and parliamentary level, there have been numerous reports on what is the future of biodiversity research, what is the future of alpha taxonomy. But university departments are just fleeing away from that type of research. It's increasingly difficult to get it funded. And I would argue that, in the case of natural history museums, is where they have a really core responsibility to generating research.